The notary looked up from the stack of documents, cleared her throat softly, and said, "I'm sorry, but there's a problem with the title." My daughter-in-law's smile disappeared. "What kind of problem?" The buyers, a young couple from Mississauga, shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. My son leaned forward. "There must be some mistake." The notary shook her head. "I'm afraid not. The registered owner of this property is not listed anywhere on this transfer agreement." And that's when she looked toward the hallway door. Because that's when I walked in. And for the first time in 8 years, my son and his wife understood who had actually owned the house they were trying to sell out from under me. But to understand how we got there, you need to know what happened the Thanksgiving before. My name is Douglas Hartwell. I'm 68 years old. I live, or lived, for a time, in a mid-sized town in southwestern Ontario, about an hour outside of Hamilton. For most of my working life, I was a journeyman electrician, and later a site supervisor for a mid-sized construction outfit. Nothing extraordinary. Long hours, cold mornings, the kind of work that leaves your hands rough by 40 and your knees complaining by 55. My wife, Carol, used to joke that I communicated better through doing things than saying them. She wasn't wrong. I'm not much of a talker. Never have been. Carol passed away 9 years ago, pancreatic cancer. It moved fast, the way it always does, and then she was gone, and the house we'd shared for 31 years felt like a place I was only visiting. I kept her reading chair in the living room for 2 full years after she died. Couldn't bring myself to move it. Our son, Trevor, was 34 when she passed. He and his wife, Joanna, had been married 3 years by then. They lived in a rented townhouse in Oakville. Trevor worked in logistics management. Joanna had just finished her second maternity leave. They had a daughter named Lily, who was 2, and a son named Callum, who was 4 months old. Things were tight for them, financially. The cost of living in the GTA had become something you either adapted to or got crushed by. About a year after Carol died, Trevor came to see me alone one evening. He sat at the kitchen table the way he used to as a boy, with his hands wrapped around a mug of tea he wasn't really drinking. "Dad," he said, "I don't know how much longer we can make it work down there." The rent on their townhouse had gone up nearly $400. Childcare was brutal. Joanna had gone back to work, but between the 2 salaries, after taxes and daycare and gas and groceries, there was almost nothing left. He looked exhausted, worn down in the way that young fathers get when they realize the life they imagined costs more than the life they can afford. I had actually been thinking about this for some time. After Carol died, I had made some decisions quietly, the way I tend to make most decisions. I sold our original family home, a larger place on the edge of town, and used the proceeds, along with some savings from 30 years of careful living, to purchase a different property on the other side of town. A comfortable house, 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, a good-sized backyard, near decent schools. I had set it up through a numbered company my lawyer helped me establish. A straightforward holding arrangement meant to simplify things when my estate eventually needed to be settled. Good estate planning, nothing clever about it. I just didn't want probate tying things up for years. I offered Trevor and Joanna the house. I told them the monthly payment would be low, enough to cover the property taxes and basic maintenance, not much more. I didn't tell them the name on the title. At the time, it seemed like an unnecessary detail. They were family. The house was for them. What did paperwork matter between a father and his son? They moved in that spring. The first 2 years were genuinely good. Trevor would come by on weekends and help me with small projects around the yard. Joanna seemed grateful, genuinely so. She thanked me at Christmas, left a card on my birthday, made sure I had a real seat at the table for family dinners. Lily and Callum were young enough that being at Grandpa's house was still the best possible thing that could happen on any given afternoon. Those were good years. But things changed. They always do, don't they? Not suddenly. Never suddenly. They change the way ice thaws, slowly beneath the surface, until one day something shifts and you realize the ground has been moving for a long time without you noticing. The comments started the way they always start. Small, easy to dismiss. Joanna mentioned once at dinner that the bathroom off the master bedroom could use updating. Fair enough. She mentioned again, a few weeks later, that the kitchen appliances were pretty dated. Still fair. Then it became a running theme. The house needed this, the house needed that. And the way she said the house began to carry a certain ownership in it that I noticed but couldn't quite name yet. Trevor, for his part, stayed quiet during most of it. That was his way. He had always avoided friction in his marriage by simply not creating it. Agreeing, deflecting, letting things pass. As a kid, I used to call it being easygoing. Now I'm not sure what to call it. One evening, I was in the kitchen making tea when Joanna came in from the backyard. She had been on the phone. I hadn't been trying to listen. But the kitchen window was open, and sound travels in a quiet neighborhood. No, the basement alone would list for more than we paid total, she was saying. A pause. Then, once we sell, we're thinking somewhere further west, maybe Alberta, maybe BC. Something with more value. Another pause, she laughed. Yeah, timing just needs to be right. I stood very still. Sell. She said it the way you say something completely ordinary. The way you'd talk about booking a vacation or trading in a car. As if the decision was already made. As if the only remaining question was when. I set down my tea and went to my room. I sat in the chair Carol used to read in. I had moved it there eventually, and I thought for a long time. My first feeling wasn't anger. It was confusion. Because in order to sell a property, you need to own it. And she didn't own it. Neither did Trevor. Their names weren't on anything. They had never signed a purchase agreement. They had never been to a notary on this property. They had simply moved in because I offered them a place to live at a fraction of what anything comparable would have cost them anywhere in the province, which meant one of two things. Either she didn't know or she didn't care. I strongly suspected it was the first. That evening, I looked at an old photograph of Carol on my nightstand. It's one I've always kept. She's standing at the edge of a dock somewhere up in Muskoka, laughing at something just off camera. I've spent a lot of evenings talking to that photograph since she died. Well, I said quietly, I think we've got a situation. In the weeks that followed, I told myself I had misunderstood. Maybe Joanna was speaking theoretically. Maybe she was venting. Maybe she was just dreaming out loud the way people do when the daily grind gets to be too much. I held on to that possibility longer than I probably should have. It's easier to doubt what you've heard than to accept what it means. But the doubt got harder to maintain. The comments toward me became less careful. One morning I came down to make breakfast, and Joanna was on the phone at the kitchen table. She glanced at me when I came in, said goodbye to whoever she was talking to, and then said, without particular venom but without any warmth either, there are actually some really nice retirement residences up in Waterloo region. My aunt looked into one. Very nice facilities. She went back to scrolling her phone. The conversation was over before I'd said a word. I poured my coffee. I thought about Carol. I went to my room. That was how those mornings went, after a while. Trevor knew something was wrong between us. I could see it in the way he looked at me sometimes. A kind of guilty, sideways glance that lasted just a moment before he looked away. One Sunday, I asked him to come to lunch, just the two of us. We went to a family restaurant we used to go to when he was a teenager. The kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that comes in thick white mugs. He ordered a club sandwich. I ordered soup. For the first half hour, we talked about nothing important. Hockey, the price of gas, his work. Then I said, Trevor, are you happy with how things are at home? He looked up. What do you mean? With us. With the arrangement. He put down his sandwich. Dad, everything's fine. Is it? He didn't answer right away. And in that pause, I heard more than he probably intended to say. Joanna's got a lot on her mind, he finally offered. I'm sure she does. She's just thinking about the future. I looked at him steadily. What kind of future? He rubbed the back of his neck. She feels like things are, I don't know. She feels like we're not moving forward. And am I part of what's holding you back? He looked at his plate. The silence went on long enough that it had its own weight. Sometimes she feels that way, he said. Yeah, I nodded once. Paid for lunch. Drove home in silence. That evening I sat for a long time before I called my lawyer. His name is Gordon. We've worked together for close to 25 years. He helped me set up the holding company help me settle Carol's estate, help me with the purchase of the house Trevor was now living in. I explained the situation. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always appreciated about him. When I finished, he said, "Douglas, legally, they can't sell. The title is in the company name, your company. You're the sole director." I know that. So what are you waiting for? It was the right question, and I didn't have a clean answer. What I had was the same stubborn hope that most fathers carry longer than they should. That if I waited long enough, my son would remember who he was. That the man I raised would eventually step forward and say something. So I waited. Thanksgiving arrived in October the way it always does in Canada. Cold evenings, the smell of leaves, hockey back on television. Joanna's family came up from Burlington. Trevor's colleague and his wife stopped by. Lily and Callum ran through the kitchen getting underfoot, while the adults circled the island with wine glasses and talked about house prices and interest rates, the way Canadians always do at family dinners. I had mostly a good evening. But then, after dinner, the conversation turned. Joanna's sister asked whether I'd thought about downsizing now that I was at that stage. I said I was comfortable where I was. Joanna laughed a small, tight laugh and said, "Oh, Douglas isn't exactly pulling his weight around here anyway. We basically look after him." She smiled when she said it, the kind of smile that makes the cruelty sound like a joke. The table went quiet for just a moment. Then someone changed the subject. I looked at Trevor. He was looking at his plate. Something settled into place in my chest right then. Not anger, just a recognition. The kind that comes when you've been telling yourself a story for too long and reality finally gets impatient with you. December arrived. I noticed real estate printouts on the dining room table one evening. Comparable sales in the neighborhood. A handwritten note with numbers I recognized as square footage estimates and rough market values. Joanna gathered them when she heard me coming down the hall, but not before I saw the name of the brokerage at the top of the page. The next morning, I drove to Gordon's office. He had the title abstract ready. We reviewed it together. Everything was exactly as we'd set it up years ago. Then he folded his hands and looked at me. "Whenever you're ready," he said. "Not yet," I told him. I don't know what I was still waiting for exactly. Maybe I needed to see how far it would go. Maybe I needed to know for certain whether Trevor would be standing beside his wife when it happened, or whether at the last moment he would do the right thing. Maybe I just needed the truth to become undeniable before I could let go of the version I'd been holding on to. I found out in November, on a Sunday evening, when I overheard Trevor on the phone in the garage. "The notary appointment is booked for December 15th, he said. A pause. "Yeah, she's handling all the paperwork." Another pause. "Dad doesn't know anything. It'll be fine." I stood in the hallway. The garage door was slightly ajar. I could see his shoulder, the side of his face in the cold blue light. "Dad doesn't know anything." I went back to my room. I sat in Carol's chair. For a long time, I didn't move. Then I picked up my phone and called Gordon. "It's time," I said. He didn't need to ask what I meant. "I'll file the documents Monday morning." The weeks between that phone call and December 15th passed in a strange kind of quiet. I didn't argue. I didn't confront. I went on making my tea in the mornings, reading in the evenings, watching the first real snow come down over the backyard, the way it always does in southwestern Ontario. Heavy and wet, the kind that sticks to everything. Joanna and Trevor made their plans around me as if I weren't there, which, I suppose, is what they'd been doing for a while. My granddaughter Lily was 14 by then, old enough to notice things. One afternoon, she knocked on my bedroom door and sat on the edge of the chair across from me. "Grandpa, are you okay?" "Why do you ask?" She shrugged. "You seem far away." I smiled at her. Sometimes grown-ups carry things they don't talk about. She nodded like she understood more than I'd said. Then she leaned over and hugged me, quietly, without making a production of it. The way Carol used to hug me when she knew something was wrong but knew I'd talk when I was ready. I held on to that hug for a while after she'd gone. December 15th arrived gray and cold. The kind of Canadian winter day that feels like the sky has given up trying. Gordon and I coordinated in the morning. He had already notified the notary's office the previous week. A professional courtesy, he called it, along with the relevant title documentation. The notary had confirmed the discrepancy. She knew what was coming. She simply hadn't told the other parties yet. I arrived at the notary's office 20 minutes before the appointment and waited in a small side room down the hall. Trevor and Joanna arrived at the scheduled time. Gordon told me later that Joanna walked in looking confident, organized. She had a folder of documents, notes, everything prepared. The buyers were already seated. A retired couple from Mississauga who wanted to move closer to family in the area. Good people, by all accounts, who had no idea they were about to witness something that had nothing to do with them. The appointment began. Documents were reviewed. The notary worked through the standard identification procedures calmly and professionally, and then she reached the title abstract. She reviewed it for a moment. Then she set it down and looked up. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "There's a problem with the title." Joanna frowned. "What kind of problem?" "The registered owner of this property is not listed on the transfer agreement." Trevor leaned forward. "That's not possible. I'm afraid it is." The notary turned a page. "The property is registered to a numbered Ontario corporation, 2847193 Ontario Inc. The sole director of that company is not present in this agreement." Joanna's voice went tight. "What are you talking about?" "We live there. We've been paying." "I understand," the notary said quietly, "but legal ownership is what governs a transfer, and the legal owner of this property is not you." A silence followed. The buyers exchanged a glance. Trevor looked at Joanna. Joanna looked at the notary. And then Gordon opened the hallway door. I stepped inside. I will never forget how Trevor looked in that moment. It wasn't the expression of a man who had been caught in something. It was the expression of a man who suddenly understood something he should have understood long ago, and who could see, all at once, exactly what that understanding was going to cost him. Joanna went pale. Then her face moved through several expressions very quickly. Confusion, shock, something that looked, briefly, like anger, and then something else, something smaller. The air went out of her completely. I sat down across from them. The buyers quietly gathered their things and excused themselves. I couldn't blame them. This was not their problem. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Joanna said, "Douglas, just my name." As if there might still be an explanation that made everything okay. "The house belongs to me," I said. Trevor closed his eyes. "I purchased that property 8 years ago. I let you live there because you were struggling and because you're my family." I kept my voice level. "Your names are not on the title. They never were. You have never signed a purchase agreement, never attended a closing, never paid property tax on that address. You have paid monthly rent, far below market, to a numbered company you never thought to look up." The room was very still. I looked at my son. All I ever asked for in return was to be treated with basic respect. Trevor put his face in his hands. Joanna had started crying, quietly. Whether it was embarrassment or remorse or simple shock, I couldn't tell. Maybe all three. I had no desire to make it worse than it already was. I said what needed to be said and nothing more. I told them they would need to find somewhere else to live. I would give them reasonable time. 2 full months, which was more than the law required, and more than they had given me on that Thanksgiving evening when Joanna suggested I look at retirement residences in Waterloo. I was not throwing them onto the street. But the arrangement was finished. Nobody argued. I signed what needed to be signed, nodded to the notary, and left. The weeks that followed were the quietest of my life. Not empty, just quiet. I moved back into the house after they cleared out in February, but by then I had started thinking that maybe the house itself wasn't what I needed anymore. Too many rooms, too much quiet of the wrong kind. I put it on the market in the spring and sold it for a number that surprised me, given what I'd paid. The market had been generous to people who bought early and held on. With the proceeds, I bought a smaller place in a town along the Lake Huron shoreline. A good-sized lot, a garage, a view of the water from the kitchen window. My neighbor across the road retired from the OPP and knows how to fix anything. The woman 2 doors down brings me butter tarts at Christmas and doesn't expect conversation in return. It's a good life, quieter than before, but quiet in the way that Carol always said she wanted for us. Uncomplicated, peaceful, earned. Lily called me the week after the notary appointment. She was upset. "Grandpa, what happened?" I told her as gently as I could that sometimes adults make choices that have consequences, and that I still loved her and Callum, and none of this changed that. She cried a little. I let her. Then she said, I didn't know. And I believed her completely. Trevor called me in March. The phone rang at 7 in the evening and I almost didn't answer. But I did. "Dad." I's voice sounded different. Older, somehow. Tired in a different way than tired from work. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me." I answered, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry." He said it plainly, without preamble or decoration. Not "I'm sorry if you felt," or "I'm sorry but you have to understand." Just, "I'm sorry." We talked for nearly an hour. He told me about the weeks after the notary appointment. About the conversation he and Joanna had that night. How long it had gone. How much of it had been hard to hear on both sides. About the things he'd seen clearly only in hindsight. How long he'd been choosing conflict avoidance over doing what was right. How many times he'd stayed quiet when he should have said something. How much of what happened he had to own for himself and not blame on anyone else. He didn't make excuses. That was what stayed with me. I told him that I had no interest in punishing him. That the decision I'd made wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. It was about the fact that somewhere along the way I had stopped being his father and started being an inconvenience in his house. And I had let that go on far too long in the hope that he would eventually remember who we were to each other. "I remember now," he said. "Good," I told him. "That's where we start." We agreed to meet for coffee the following weekend. And we did. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't warm. Not yet. Trust doesn't work on a schedule. But it was honest. That was enough for a beginning. Joanna reached out a few weeks later by text, which I thought was very much like her. Measured. Careful. The message was brief. "I know I can't undo what happened. I'm sorry for how I treated you. I hope someday you'll be willing to see us again." I thought about it for a day. Then I wrote back, "I'm willing. Let's take it slowly." And we have. Slowly. The following Thanksgiving I hosted dinner at my house on the lake. Trevor and Joanna drove up. Lily and Callum came. My cousin Dale and his wife drove over from Goderich. We ate turkey and watched the last period of a hockey game, and Callum fell asleep on the couch before dessert, the way kids always do at family dinners when they've been running around all day. At some point in the evening, I stepped out onto the back deck by myself. The lake was dark and flat, a few lights from the far shore reflecting across the water. The air had that particular sharpness that Lake Huron gets in October, clean and cold and honest. I thought about Carol. I almost always think about Carol when something important happens, or when something important doesn't happen anymore. I thought about what she would say if she could see all of it. The house, the notaries, office, the drive back alone, and then this evening, the lights in the kitchen, the voices carrying through the glass door behind me. She'd have seen it coming long before I did. She always did. And she would have told me exactly what she told me 1,000 times when I was being too patient with the wrong things. Douglas. Know your worth. I stayed on the deck for a while longer. Then I went back inside. The kitchen was warm and loud and full of people who, slowly and imperfectly, were finding their way back to me. And I was, slowly and imperfectly, letting them. If you've ever been made to feel like a burden by the people who owe you the most, if you've ever stayed quiet when you should have spoken or given more than you could afford and been thanked with resentment, I hope this reminds you of something simple. Your history doesn't disappear just because someone is no longer paying attention to it. Neither does your worth. And it is never too late, not at 68 or 78 or any age, to insist on being treated like a human being. Thank you for listening. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment. I'd like to hear about it. And if you're new here, consider sticking around. There are more stories where this one came from.